Recently, I was asked to help a course here on campus by providing some tips on how to improve the photography of a class project. Specifically, it was a group of UW-Madison students taking photographs of student-generated art out in a local nonprofit. What I tried to do was give some practical advice that was also hands-on in nature and took advantage of the kinds of equipment that students would realistically have access to. So the kinds of things like we see here are like a very, very simple point and shoot, Nikon camera in this case, no manual controls really to speak of. Same with the iPad 2. And then just for point of comparison, the mirrorless 4/3 camera. Now, Annie, my volunteer, took the iPad 2 as her kind of weapon of choice and took this snapshot without me even really prompting her. This was her first impulse. And you can see how unusable this is, very grainy, no detail. So that really brings us to our first tip, which is to consider the quantity of light. Often we're thinking about how we can shape the light or have something look cool, but if we think about the way that a camera sees versus how our eyes see, our eyes are so much more sensitive and adaptive than a typical camera. So even in this situation, when I mentioned that we didn't really have enough light to capture this artifact appropriately, Annie, the volunteer, was kind of incredulous and like a little bit disbelieving because to her, it was like a bright office. And yes, to a human being whose eyes are an amazing camera system, it was perfectly, brilliantly light. But to the camera, it just doesn't have enough energy to render the image the way that we would want it to be, sharp, clear, crisp. So when you're in a situation where you need to take a picture, an indoor situation almost always is going to need some supplemental light or the control of the camera to optimize its sensitivity. That might mean using a tripod so that there's no blur. It might mean just turning on a bunch of lights or adding supplementary light. The other thing I think we can see with this example photo is that it really just looks like a casual image of this aspirin tin taken on the top of a table. And especially when you're photographing art, you want to try to make that thing special or stand on its own. And one of the ways that you can do that is isolate it. I remember when I first got this tip, I was working at a private university in central Montana, and the art professor there was, of course, talented and a great teacher, but she also had to be really resourceful. And when I came in to photograph some of the ceramics that were going out for an exhibition, she pulled out this big piece of wool felt and said, "David, this is my personal piece of felt. I don't know where you get these kind of things these days, but it sure comes in handy when you're trying to photograph artwork." So it's really just a very simple way to make artwork in your photography more effective, and it's super cheap. This thing was this is a synthetic piece of felt that I got at Michael's for under $2. The other thing that I think this speaks to is that you don't really need specialized equipment to do a lot of the things that you need to do to improve your photography. For instance, I don't really need this wool piece of felt to accomplish this task. Like I can take my black smart wool pullover and accomplish the very same thing. So it's really just kind of looking around and challenging the notion that we run into sometimes that if only we had the better thing that we could do the work that needs to be done. The other thing that we needed to do in this shoot was to kind of just prop up the wool felt. And, there's no solution that's better than just like looking around the room and finding something that we can kind of prop up the piece of felt with so that it creates this sort of envelope of darkness that's going to surround our image. So yeah, just kind of look around and use what you have. So the next thing I'm going to do is have Annie take a new photograph with this black background. And what we're going to see is that the camera is trying to expose the black background so that you can see it, so that it's appropriately exposed. And that's going to result in a photograph that's even worse than the first one. And you can really see how it's trying to expose the black, and it's very noisy. So then tap right where they bridge each other. Yeah. And then take the shot now. Oh, sorry. No. Oh, wait, yeah, we got it. Let's do that again. So now tap and hold. Tap and hold. Now release. And you see at the bottom of the screen it says AE lock. I'm going to remove this. Now take the shot. Okay, so much better isolation.
Yeah.
What you'll find is that on a traditional camera, this is the halfway depressed shutter. So it will kind of lock your focus and your exposure while you recompose. And this is the same concept on the iPad. So it's not a new kind of fancy smartphone control. It's on both the little point and shoots, as the iPads, iPhones, and of course the big cameras have manual controls as well. So it's the full range of any camera that you'd likely use. But what you'll need to do is kind of think about how all camera systems use an average reflectance to judge exposure, and that average reflectance is also known as 18% gray. So when I place the very, very white, bright notepad in the scene and then have Annie do her focus and exposure based on that white card, it's going to then push down the exposure on the black so that it becomes pure black, and the exposure on the tin becomes perfect and therefore becomes much, much more isolated and more effective and a better image. And then move in physically a little bit. A little more. You know, the next thing is really just to challenge your notion of where you're placing the camera on first instinct. Because, you know, even though we hear all the time that, you know, our first impulse is often the best impulse, in photography, I don't know if that's necessarily true. You know, we choose where we're going to choose maybe because of other factors, because of circumstance, and directing this kind of change is not rocket science. In this case, what we're doing is simply getting closer. And just having that mental sort of cue that, oh, wait a minute, I don't have to choose just this point of view to render my final image can be helpful. The idea of the inverse square law is one of these things. I mean, it's covered in every kind of video production course, photography course. It's something that you could probably spin out infinitely based on how sophisticated you were using light, but it's one of these things that you cannot really escape. If you have even a vague notion of how that applies to photography, you're going to be able to improve how you deal with your situation in available light, with low light, with nothing more than, you know, in this case, a bike light in your backpack. But the law is essentially that the intensity of your light source is going to be inversely proportional to the square of the separation distance. And what that practically means is that if you start out in this situation where you have it maybe an inch away from your subject and then you move it 2 inches away, that it's going to be 1/4 of the light. And if you move it 10 inches away, it's going to really, really decrease in an exponential fashion so that you're only going to get about 1% of the light fallout just by moving it back by, 10 inches. Let's review those. Yeah. So that's like with a little highlight added in from the bike light. That's as is. Actually, there was some light, but it was a little further away. And then
this is as is, I think.
As is. That's exposure lock from a little bit of a distance. A couple attempts there. And then that's like, that's a huge difference just by utilizing a couple of different techniques, right?